When we speak about the promise, we must begin where Dr. Charles Stanley always began, with the character of God. Before we talk about plans, outcomes, open doors, closed doors, blessings, or breakthroughs, we have to ask a more foundational question. Who is the one making the promise? Because a promise is only as stable as the person who gives it. Charles Stanley built his ministry on a conviction that was both theologically orthodox and psychologically profound. God's promises are personal and unchanging. That sounds simple, almost too simple, but if you pause long enough to think about it, you realize how radical that claim actually is. Most of us have been shaped by broken promises. We grow up in environments where words shift, commitments dissolve, loyalties fracture. Parents fail, leaders disappoint, institutions collapse, and over time something subtle happens inside the human psyche. We begin to treat every promise as provisional. We learn to protect ourselves by lowering expectation. We become cautious with hope. So when Scripture declares that God makes promises, real ones, concrete ones, the modern mind hesitates. Yes, but what if? What if circumstances change? What if I fail? What if I misunderstand? What if I'm not worthy? Those questions reveal something critical. We have unconsciously projected human instability onto a divine being. Stanley would not allow that projection to stand. At First Baptist Church, Atlanta, week after week, he returned to a central truth. God does not adjust his character to accommodate your doubt. He does not revise his integrity based on your inconsistency. He does not wake up one morning reconsidering what he has declared. The promises of God are anchored in the nature of God, and that nature does not fluctuate. Philosophically, this is essential. If God is the ground of being itself, if he is the necessary foundation beneath all contingent reality, then change in him would imply instability at the core of existence. And if the core is unstable, everything built upon it collapses into chaos. But the biblical claim is the opposite, that beneath the shifting terrain of history stands an unshifting reality. Psychologically, that changes everything. Human beings require stability to flourish. We need something fixed in order to orient ourselves properly in the world. Imagine trying to navigate with a compass that changes north every hour. You would become disoriented, anxious, paralyzed. Much of modern anxiety, in fact, comes from living in a world where moral and existential north seems negotiable. Stanley understood that when a person anchors their life to an unchanging God, they regain orientation. The promise becomes a stabilizing force, not a vague optimism, not positive thinking, a stabilizing force rooted in reality. But notice something else. The promises are not merely unchanging, they are personal. That is where the message moves from abstract theology into intimate transformation. A general promise inspires crowds. A personal promise transforms individuals. Stanley often emphasized that God's word is not a collection of inspirational slogans floating in the air. It is God speaking to you. That can feel almost unsettling, because if the promise is personal, then it addresses your fear specifically, your calling specifically, your obedience specifically. And here's where the psychological tension emerges. We want divine reassurance without divine involvement. We want God to guarantee outcomes without interfering with our autonomy. But a personal promise implies relationship. It implies that God is not an impersonal force or distant architect. He is engaged. And engagement means accountability. If God promises to guide, then you must be willing to follow. If he promises provision, you must be willing to trust. If he promises transformation, you must be willing to surrender the parts of yourself that resist change. This is why Stanley's teaching never drifted into sentimentalism. He did not present God's promises as emotional comfort blankets. He presented them as covenantal realities, solid, binding, reliable, but also demanding, and that demand is not cruelty. It is dignity, because a personal promise assumes you matter. It assumes your choices matter. It assumes your obedience participates in a larger, coherent plan. Think about what that does to a person who feels insignificant. In a world of billions where algorithms determine visibility and cultural currents shift by the hour, the idea that the creator of the universe makes promises that apply directly to your life is staggering. It restores weight to your existence. It means your decisions echo beyond immediate circumstances. But here is the critical clarification Stanley made repeatedly. The certainty of God's promise does not eliminate difficulty. It reframes it. When circumstances deteriorate, the natural human impulse is to reinterpret the promise. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe God changed his mind. Maybe this isn't for me. But if the promise is anchored in God's unchanging character, then changing circumstances cannot nullify it. They may obscure it. They may test your confidence in it, but they cannot erase it. And that realization becomes the foundation for everything else we will discuss: God's greater plan, the necessity of waiting, the call to obedience, the role of trials. All of it rests on this first pillar. God is not improvising your life. He is fulfilling what he has already declared. If you internalize that, truly internalize it, your posture toward uncertainty shifts. You stop scrambling for control and start listening for direction. You stop interpreting delay as abandonment and begin seeing it as development. You stop measuring God's faithfulness by immediate outcomes and start measuring it by his immutable nature. And here's the question that confronts every one of us. Will you anchor your life to what shifts or to what stands? Because if God's promises are personal and unchanging, then the instability you feel is not evidence of his unreliability. It is an invitation to deeper trust. And that leaves you with a decision. Will you treat his promises as comforting ideas or as governing realities? Having giving realities because your future will be shaped by whatever you decide is truly unshakable. If we accept that God's promises are personal and unchanging, then we are immediately confronted with a second, and perhaps more unsettling truth. God's plan is often not the one we would have designed. Charles Stanley returned to this theme repeatedly throughout his decades at First Baptist Church, Atlanta. He understood something about human nature that is both psychologically obvious and spiritually profound. We all have a plan. Consciously or unconsciously, we carry around a mental blueprint of how our lives should unfold: career trajectory, relationships, timing, recognition, impact, recognition, impact. Even our suffering, we tend to script that too, limiting how much we think is reasonable, and then reality intervenes. A door closes that we were certain God had opened. A relationship fractures despite sincere prayer. A career path collapses after years of disciplined effort. And in those moments, we don't merely feel disappointment. We experience disorientation, because when our plan fails, it threatens our sense of competence and control. Here is the uncomfortable truth Stanley never softened. Your plan is limited by your perspective, and your perspective is finite. Philosophically, that is self-evident. You occupy a single point in space and time. You see fragments. You interpret events through the lens of memory, emotion, cultural conditioning, and personal ambition. You are not omniscient, and yet, functionally, most of us live as though we are qualified to draft the master blueprint of our own existence. That is not arrogance in the cartoonish sense. It is something subtler. It is the natural human impulse to reduce uncertainty. We create plans because they provide psychological stability. A plan gives the illusion of predictability, and predictability lowers anxiety. But what happens when God's plan disrupts ours? Stanley insisted that disruption is not evidence of divine negligence. It is often evidence of divine intention. The plan of God operates from a vantage point that integrates eternity, character formation, unseen consequences, and the lives of countless others intersecting with your own. You and I cannot calculate that complexity. We don't possess the cognitive architecture for it. And this is where trust becomes more than sentiment. It becomes a rational necessity. If God's promises are rooted in his unchanging character, then his plan must also be consistent with that character. which means even when it contradicts your expectations, it does not contradict His goodness. That is a difficult claim to hold emotionally, but intellectually it is coherent. Consider this: much of what you now value in yourself was forged in circumstances you would never have chosen. Resilience is born from adversity. Wisdom emerges from failure properly examined. Compassion deepens through suffering. Courage develops when fear is faced voluntarily. If you had written your own story with maximum comfort and minimum resistance, many of those qualities would remain dormant. Stanley understood that God's plan is not primarily about your comfort. It is about your conformity to Christ, to maturity, to eternal purpose. That reframes the entire discussion. The question shifts from, is this what I wanted, to is this shaping me into who I am meant to become? Psychologically, that shift is transformative. It relocates meaning from immediate satisfaction to long-term formation. You begin to evaluate experiences not merely by how pleasant they are, but by what they are producing in you. Now, this does not mean passivity. Trusting God's plan is not fatalism. It is not an abdication of responsibility. Stanley never advocated a detached spirituality where you simply wait for events to unfold. Rather, he emphasized alignment. You act, you decide, you move forward, but you hold your plan with open hands, and that posture requires humility. Humility is not self-deprecation. It is accurate self-assessment. It is acknowledging the limits of your knowledge without denying your capacity for action. When you recognize that God's plan is greater than your own, you are not diminishing yourself. You are situating yourself properly within reality. And reality is structured hierarchically. There is an order to existence. When you attempt to place yourself at the apex, functionally acting as the ultimate authority over your destiny, you assume a burden you were never designed to carry. The anxiety that follows is predictable. But when you accept that there is a sovereign intelligence operating beyond your comprehension, something remarkable happens internally. The pressure to orchestrate every outcome begins to lift. You still strive. You still pursue excellence. But you are no longer crushed by the illusion that everything depends solely on you. Stanley often pointed out that many of our greatest frustrations stem not from God's absence, but from our resistance. We cling to a vision of success or timing that may be fundamentally misaligned with the larger narrative God is writing. And because we cannot see that narrative in full, we interpret deviation as disaster. Yet history, both biblical and personal, suggests a different pattern. What initially appears as detour frequently becomes destiny. What feels like loss becomes redirection. What seems like failure becomes preparation. The challenge is temporal. We want immediate clarity. God often provides progressive revelation. He rarely hands you the entire blueprint. He gives you enough light for the next step. And that demands courage, because stepping into a plan you do not fully understand requires relinquishing the illusion of total control. It means admitting that your intellect, your ambition, your forecasting, all valuable, are still subordinate to a higher wisdom. So the question becomes deeply personal. Are you willing to let God's definition of better override your own? Because if His plan truly integrates dimensions you cannot perceive, eternal impact, unseen protection, character refinement, then insisting on your version may not be strength. It may be short-sightedness. Trusting that God's plan is greater does not eliminate uncertainty. It redeems it. It transforms uncertainty from threat into an arena in which faith is exercised. Chara. Keter is formed and purpose is clarified. And perhaps the most sobering realization is this: you will follow a plan. The only question is whose was. If you cling rigidly to your own, you may gain control but lose depth. If you surrender to God's, you may lose the illusion of control but gain alignment with something infinitely more enduring. So examine the blueprint you are defending so fiercely. Ask yourself whether it is large enough to hold eternity. Because the plan you insist upon will shape the person you become. If God's promises are unchanging, And if his plan is greater than our own, then we inevitably collide with a third reality that tests both convictions: waiting. No one applauds the concept of waiting. It is not glamorous. It does not photograph well. It does not produce immediate testimony. And yet, if you examine the architecture of spiritual maturity, you will find that waiting is not incidental, it is structural. Charles Stanley said repeatedly in his teaching ministry that delay is not denial. That sounds simple, almost like a slogan. But psychologically, it addresses one of the deepest vulnerabilities in the human condition: our struggle with suspended resolution. We are creatures oriented toward progress. We measure movement. We track outcomes. We measure movement. We track outcomes. When effort does not produce visible advancement, something destabilizing happens internally. Doubt begins to whisper. Perhaps I misunderstood the promise. Perhaps the plan has changed. Perhaps I am forgotten. Waiting exposes what we truly believe about God. At First Baptist Church Atlanta, Stanley often pointed out that the interval between promise and fulfillment is where faith is either refined or abandoned, and that interval can be long, longer than is comfortable, longer than seems reasonable, longer than seems reasonable. Philosophically, waiting confronts us with time itself. We live within time, God does not. Our perception is linear and immediate. We experience moments sequentially, and that sequence can feel painfully slow when anticipation is involved. But from an eternal vantage point, what feels delayed to us may be precisely timed within a broader narrative we cannot see. Now, that theological explanation is coherent, but it does not automatically make waiting easier. The real struggle is psychological. Waiting strips away distraction. It removes the illusion that we are controlling the outcome through sheer activity. In seasons of acceleration, we can confuse motion with meaning. But in seasons of waiting, we are forced to confront ourselves, our impatience, our fear, our craving for certainty. And that confrontation is not punishment. It is formation. Consider what happens in prolonged uncertainty. You begin to ask deeper questions. Why do I need this outcome so urgently? What identity have I attached to it? What fear is driving my demand for immediate resolution? Waiting reveals the attachments you did not know you had. Stanley understood that God often uses waiting to purify desire, not to eliminate it, but to refine it. There is a difference between wanting something for ego reinforcement and wanting something for ego reinforcement. Time has a way of exposing the distinction. We tend to assume that if God has promised something, it should manifest quickly. But what if the delay is not about the promise at all? What if it is about the person who will receive it? Imagine granting immense responsibility to someone whose character is not yet stable enough to carry it. The gift becomes destructive. Success without maturity corrodes integrity. Influence without humility distorts judgment. Power without discipline destabilizes the soul. Waiting then is preparation. Psychologically speaking, the ability to delay gratification is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success and well-being. That is not merely a spiritual principle. It is an empirical observation. The disciplined capacity to endure present discomfort for future reward reflects internal order. It signals that a person is not enslaved to impulse. When God calls you to wait, He is not withholding good arbitrarily. He is strengthening your internal architecture so that when the promise arrives, it does not collapse under the weight of your unpreparedness. And yet, waiting can feel indistinguishable from abandonment. This is where trust in God's unchanging character becomes essential. If His promises are rooted in who He is, not in fluctuating circumstances, then the silence of a season does not equate to the absence of intention. The plan has not stalled. It is unfolding at a pace calibrated to factors you cannot fully evaluate. Stanley would often caution against interpreting delay emotionally rather than theologically. Our emotions are real, but they are not ultimate arbiters of truth. The feeling of stagnation does not nullify the reality of progress occurring beneath the surface. Think of roots. A tree that grows too rapidly above ground without establishing depth below will eventually collapse under pressure. Waiting is root work. It is unseen. It is slow, but it is stabilizing. The modern world conditions us for immediacy. Instant communication, instant access, instant results. That conditioning erodes our tolerance for process. But God's economy is not structured around our impatience. It is structured around transformation, and transformation requires time. There is also a moral dimension to waiting. It reveals whether you trust God's timing more than your own manipulation. When faced with delay, the temptation is to force outcomes, to open doors prematurely, to promise principles for acceleration, to manufacture what God has not yet delivered. Waiting asks a hard question. Will you remain faithful in obscurity? Will you remain faithful in obscurity? Because obscurity tests motivation. If no one sees, if recognition is delayed, if validation does not arrive on schedule, will you still obey? That is not a peripheral issue. It is central to character. Stanley's life embodied this truth. Decades of steady teaching, consistent obedience, and patient endurance produced influence that could not have been engineered artificially. It was accumulated, not assembled. So perhaps the season you are resisting most fiercely is the one shaping you most profoundly. What if the delay you resent is the discipline you require? What if the silence you fear is the space in which your faith is being strengthened? What if the very act of waiting is the mechanism through which God aligns your heart with His plan? Waiting is not wasted time. Waiting is not wasted time. It is active trust. And here is the uncomfortable but liberating realization. If God has promised, and if His plan is greater than yours, then rushing the process is not faith, it is interference. So the next time you find yourself suspended between promise and fulfillment, do not immediately ask, why is nothing happening? Ask instead, what is being formed in me? Because the person you become while you wait may be the very answer to the prayer you are praying. And that leaves you with a choice. Resist the process or be refined by it. Delay is not denial, it is development. If waiting forms the internal architecture of faith, then obedience is the structure that rises upon it. You can affirm that God's promises are unchanging. You can concede that His plan is greater. You can even endure seasons of delay. But none of that becomes transformative until it translates into action. This is where the conversation becomes concrete. Charles Stanley was unambiguous on this point throughout his leadership of In Touch Ministries and his decades of preaching. Obedience positions you to experience God's best, not because obedience earns the promise, but because it aligns you with the plan. That distinction matters. We recoil instinctively at the suggestion that blessing is tied to obedience because we fear sliding into legalism, as though God were a bureaucrat distributing rewards for moral performance, but that is a caricature. Stanley's emphasis was not transactional. It was structural. Reality itself is structured in such a way that alignment produces stability and misalignment produces friction. If you violate the laws of physics, you suffer consequences, not because gravity is vindictive, but because gravity is consistent. In the same way, if God's promises flow along the channels of His design, then stepping outside that design disrupts your ability to experience what He intends to give. Obedience, then, is not about appeasing God. It is about cooperating with reality as He has ordered it. Psychologically, this introduces an uncomfortable truth. Many of the frustrations we attribute to divine silence are actually the result of selective obedience. We want the outcome without the discipline. We want clarity without surrender. We want divine guidance while reserving the right to override it. That internal division creates instability of override it. Stanley often spoke about the simplicity of obedience, not its ease. Its simplicity. Most of the time we know the next right step. It may not be the entire blueprint, but it is enough. Forgive that person, tell the truth, decline that compromise. End that destructive pattern. Begin that necessary habit. The difficulty is not intellectual confusion, it is moral resistance. And resistance fragments the self. When you know what is right and refuse to act on it, you create internal dissonance. Your conscience signals misalignment. Your rationalizations attempt to quiet it. Over time, that tension erodes clarity. Obedience, by contrast, integrates the personality. Your belief, your speech, and your action move in the same direction. There is coherence there, and coherence generates strength. But obedience requires trust. If God's plan is truly greater, then His instructions, even when they contradict your preferences, are not arbitrary restrictions. They are protective boundaries and directional markers. Yet we tend to interpret constraint as limitation rather than liberation. Consider the paradox. Discipline feels restrictive in the moment, but it expands capacity over time. The athlete who submits to rigorous training gains freedom of movement and endurance. The musician who practices scales relentlessly gains creative expression. Structure precedes mastery. In spiritual life, obedience is that structure. Stanley understood that partial obedience is not obedience, it is negotiation. And negotiation subtly places you back at the center of authority. I will follow here, but not there. I will surrender this, but not that. The problem is not merely moral, it is hierarchical. You cannot experience the fullness of God's plan while retaining ultimate control if this is where pride becomes the hidden obstacle. Pride resists obedience because obedience implies submission. And submission challenges the illusion of autonomy we guard so fiercely. Yet autonomy without alignment leads to fragmentation. You may feel free in the short term, but you drift from the very source of coherence. Obedience restores order. It also clarifies direction. Many people ask God for guidance while ignoring the last instruction they received. But revelation is progressive. Faithfulness at one level opens responsibility at the next. This is not arbitrary, it is developmental. You do not entrust greater authority to someone who has not proven faithful in smaller matters. And here is something sobering. Obedience is often costly in the short term. It may cost you reputation, it may cost you comfort. It may cost you opportunities that appear advantageous. But the cost of disobedience is almost always greater, though less immediately visible. It costs integrity. It costs peace. It costs alignment with the very promises you claim to trust. Stanley's life reflected steadily disciplined obedience over decades. Not dramatic, impulsive gestures, but consistent alignment. And that consistency produced impact far beyond what charisma alone could sustain. We often imagine that experiencing God's best means dramatic intervention or spectacular blessing, but frequently it looks like something quieter: clarity of conscience, stability of character, resilience under pressure, influence rooted in integrity. Obedience shapes you into someone capable of carrying promise without being corrupted by it. And there is another dimension. Obedience cultivates sensitivity. When you respond promptly to conviction, your perception sharpens. When you repeatedly ignore it, your perception dulls. This is not mystical. It is psychological. Habits of responsiveness strengthen neural pathways. Habits of resistance reinforce avoidance. Over time, you either become more attuned to God's direction or more insulated from it. So the question is not whether God's promises are real. The question is whether your life is aligned to receive them. You cannot live in sustained contradiction to His design and expect seamless participation in His plan. Alignment matters, not as a prerequisite for being loved, but as a condition for experiencing the fullness of what love intends to give. And perhaps the most practical takeaway is this: stop waiting for a dramatic sign and obey the last clear instruction you received. Because clarity often follows courage. God's best is not hidden behind mystery. It is often hidden behind mystery. It is often hidden behind the next act of obedience you are postponing. And that leaves you with a sobering reflection. The door you are praying God would open may be waiting on the step you refuse to take. Obey what you know and watch what unfolds. If obedience aligns us with God's design, then we must confront a reality that tests that alignment more than anything else: trials. It is one thing to speak about promises when circumstances are stable. It is another thing entirely to hold those promises when life fractures. And here is where the conversation becomes existentially serious, because suffering is not theoretical. It is not abstract. It is deeply personal. Charles Stanley did not present the Christian life as insulated from hardship. In fact, he repeatedly insisted that trials are not interruptions of God's plan. They are instruments within it. That claim, if true, changes how you interpreted adversity at the most fundamental level. The instinctive human response to suffering is to ask, why is this happening to me? Implicit in that question is the assumption that difficulty signals deviation, that somehow the presence of pain indicates that something has gone wrong. But what if difficulty is not deviation? What if it is development? What philosophically, you cannot construct a meaningful life without engaging suffering voluntarily. Every worthwhile aim demands sacrifice. Every responsibility introduces burden. The alternative to meaningful suffering is not comfort, it is emptiness. Avoiding hardship entirely often leads to fragility, and fragility collapses under pressure. Stanley understood this deeply. He maintained that God wastes nothing, that even the experiences we would never choose can be repurposed into strength, wisdom, compassion, and resilience. That does not trivialize pain. It dignifies it. Psychologically, this is transformative. If suffering is meaningless, it crushes you. If it is purposeful, it refines you. The difference lies in interpretation. Consider how trials function structurally. Pressure reveals weakness. It exposes cracks in foundation that comfort conceals. When adversity strikes, you discover what you actually believe, not what you claim to believe. You discover whether your trust in God's promise was conditional or rooted in His character. Trials strip away illusion, and that stripping, painful as it is, produces clarity. You begin to see attachments that were misordered. You recognize dependencies that were unstable. You confront parts of yourself that were underdeveloped. In that sense, trials are diagnostic tools, but they are also strengthening mechanisms. Muscle grows through resistance. Character grows through challenge. Courage is not formed in safety. It is forged in risk. If God's plan is aimed at shaping you into someone capable of bearing responsibility, influence, and eternal weight, then trials are not optional. They are necessary. Now, this does not mean every hardship is directly engineered by God in some simplistic, mechanistic way. The world is complex, human freedom, and introduces chaos. Natural processes unfold with indifference to personal preference. But within that complexity, the Christian claim is that God is sovereign enough to redeem what He does not author. That is a profound distinction. Redemption means transformation of meaning. It means that what was intended for harm can be reoriented toward growth. It means that even loss can deepen empathy. Even failure can sharpen discernment. Even betrayal can sharpen discernment. Even betrayal can strengthen resolve. Stanley often emphasized that trials drive us toward dependence. And dependence and a culture that idolizes autonomy feels like weakness. But dependence on God is not regression. It is recalibration. It is recalibration. It restores proper hierarchy. It acknowledges that you are not self-sustaining. And here is the paradox. When you accept your limits and lean into divine strength, you often discover capacities you did not know you possessed. Adversity forces choice. You can become bitter, or you can become better. You can close inward, or you can open upward. The trial itself does not determine the outcome. Your response does. That is where obedience intersects with suffering. When pain tempts you to abandon conviction, obedience anchors you. When confusion clouds clarity, discipline stabilizes perception. When delay stretches endurance, trust prevents collapse. And over time, something remarkable happens. You begin to see patterns. You look back at seasons you once resented and recognize that they were pivotal. The job that fell through redirected you toward a more aligned calling. The relational rupture exposed insecurity that needed healing. The prolonged struggle cultivated patience you could not have learned otherwise. This retrospective clarity does not eliminate the pain you felt in the moment, but it reframes it. Stanley's life itself was marked by public challenge and personal difficulty. Yet his consistent message was not that trials disappear for the faithful, it was that trials deepen the faithful. There is also a communal dimension to this. The strength you gain through adversity becomes a resource for others. Suffering, processed properly, increases compassion. It equips you to speak with authority born of experience rather than abstraction. Your scars become maps for someone else navigating similar terrain. In that sense, trials expand your usefulness. If God's promise is personal and His plan is greater, and waiting refines patience and obedience aligns you, then trials solidify you. They test the integrity of the entire structure. The question is not whether you will face adversity. The question is whether you will interpret it as evidence against God's faithfulness or as an instrument within it. That interpretive decision shapes your trajectory. Because when you view trials as meaningless interruptions, you endure them resentfully. But when you see them as tools, difficult, painful, but purposeful, you endure them constructively, and constructively endurance builds unshakable character. And constructive endurance builds unshakable character. So the next time pressure intensifies, instead of asking only, "How do I escape this?" consider asking, "What is this shaping in me?" Because the very struggle you wish away may be the forge in which your strength is formed. Do not waste your trial. Let it build you into someone who can carry the promise without collapsing under its weight. If we follow this line of reasoning all the way to its conclusion, if God's promises are unchanging, if His plan is greater than ours, if waiting refines us, if obedience aligns us, if obedience aligns us, if obedience aligns us, and if trials strengthen us, then we are brought to a final and unavoidable realization. The ultimate promise is not circumstantial. It is relational. At the center of everything, Doctor, is circumstantial. It is relational. Charles Stanley taught was not merely a strategy for successful living. It was not self-improvement dressed in theological language. It was a person. The claim of Christianity is not simply that God gives guidance or provision or endurance. It is that God gives Himself most fully revealed in Jesus Christ that shifts the entire structure of the conversation. Because if the greatest promise is Christ Himself, then the aim of God's plan is not primarily comfort, success, or even stability. It is communion. It is reconciliation between finite, fractured human beings and the infinite source of being. Philosophically, that is astonishing. Human beings long for ultimate meaning. We search for it in achievement, in relationships, in recognition, in accumulation, but every finite object eventually reveals its limits. Careers plateau, applause fades, possessions decay. Even the most profound human relationships, as precious as they are, cannot bear the full weight of our existential longing. There is something in us that reaches beyond the material. Stanley understood that this longing is not a psychological defect. It is a spiritual indicator. It points toward the reality that we were not designed to be self-contained. We were designed for relationship with God. And without that relationship, every ought. Her promise feels partial. This is why you can achieve what you once prayed for and still feel unsettled. The promotion comes, the relationship forms, the financial pressure eases, and yet beneath the surface there remains a question. Is this all? If the promise is reduced to circumstances, fulfillment will always be fragile. Because circumstances fluctuate. Because circumstances fluctuate. But if the promise is Christ Himself, His presence, His forgiveness, His transforming power, then you possess something that suffering cannot confiscate and success cannot corrupt. Psychologically, this provides an unshakable center. Identity rooted in performance is unstable. Identity rooted in comparison is exhausting. Identity rooted in possession is temporary, but identity rooted in relationship with God is secure because it is anchored in His unchanging character, not your fluctuating output, That security frees you. It frees you from striving to prove your worth. It frees you from the terror of failure. It frees you from the intoxicating but hollow pursuit of validation. When you know that you are reconciled to the Creator, that your standing is established not by your perfection but by His grace, you operate from acceptance rather than for acceptance. And that distinction transforms motivation. Obedience becomes response rather than transaction. Waiting becomes trust rather than desperation. Trials become refinement rather than rejection. Everything we have discussed finds coherence when viewed through this lens. But there is also a moral dimension here that cannot be ignored. Relationship with Christ is not abstract admiration. It is surrender. It is acknowledgement that you are not ultimate. It is repentance, a turning away from self-sovereignty and toward divine authority. And that is where modern sensibilities often resist. We prefer spirituality without submission. We prefer inspiration without accountability. Yet the Christian claim is clear. Reconciliation requires humility. It requires admitting that autonomy has limits and that sin, however unfashionable the word, fractures both the individual and the world. Stanley did not dilute this truth. 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 He spoke plainly about salvation, not as cultural affiliation, but as personal decision. The promise of eternal life, forgiveness, and restored relationship is extended universally, but it must be received individually. That reception is both simple and profound. It is simple because it is not earned. It is accepted. It is profound because it is not earned. It is accepted. It is profound because it reorders the hierarchy of your life. Christ is no longer an accessory to your plan. He becomes the center of it. And here is where everything converges. If Christ is the ultimate promise, then God's plan is fundamentally about shaping you into Christlikeness. Waiting teaches dependence that mirrors His trust in the Father. Obedience reflects His submission to divine will. Trials echo His suffering and cultivate resilience, anchored in hope. The entire journey is relational formation. This means that even if certain earthly promises remain unfulfilled in the way you imagine, the deepest promise remains intact. You are not alone. You are not abandoned. You are invited into communion with the one who transcends time, suffering, and death itself. That is not escapism. It is ultimate realism, because every human life ends in confrontation with mortality. Achievements fade. Bodies weaken. Reputations dissolve. If your hope is confined to temporal outcomes, death renders it fragile. But if your hope is rooted in Christ, His life, His resurrection, His eternal nature, then death does not have the final word. Stanley's confidence was not in institutional legacy or personal accomplishment. It was in the sufficiency of Christ. And that leaves you with the most important question of his entire discussion. Have you reduced God's promise to what He can do for you? Or have you received the promise of who He is? Because the difference is eternal. You can spend your life pursuing fragments, career, security, affirmation, or you can anchor yourself to the source from which all meaning flows. If Christ is truly the ultimate promise, then the most rational decision you can make is not to adjust your schedule or refine your strategy. It is to surrender your life. Everything else is secondary. So do not settle for blessings without relationship. Do not chase provision while ignoring the provider.